about my childhood friend. The summer of 1985 was when everything changed. I was 13, living in a small town nestled deep in the woods, far from the bustling cities and their neon lights. Our house, an old wooden structure that creaked with every gust of wind, stood at the edge of town, right where the forest began to thicken. I remember the constant smell of pine and damp earth that hung in the air, a scent that seemed to seep into everything: our clothes, our hair, even our dreams. The forest was always there, a looming presence just beyond our backyard, its shadow stretching towards our house like long, gnarled fingers. My parents were, well, they were there, but not really. Dad worked long hours at the local factory, leaving before dawn and returning long after dusk. Mom kept herself busy with community activities, always rushing from one meeting to another. They were like ghosts, flitting in and out of my life, leaving behind half-eaten dinners and hastily scribbled notes. I spent most of my time alone, wandering the creaky halls of our house or sitting on the back porch, staring into the depths of the forest. There was something about those woods that both terrified and fascinated me. The way the light filtered through the leaves, creating patterns on the forest floor. The whispers of the wind through the branches, sometimes sounding almost like words. School was, well, it was school. I didn't have many friends. The other kids found me weird, I guess. Too quiet, too prone to staring off into space. I didn't mind, not really. I had my books, my imagination, and the forest. It was on one particularly stifling afternoon in July that I first ventured deep into the woods. The air in the house had become unbearable, thick with unspoken tensions and the oppressive heat of summer. I remember standing at the edge of our yard, looking into the cool darkness beneath the trees. It was like the forest was calling to me, offering an escape. I stepped into the shadows, feeling the immediate drop in temperature. The sounds of the town faded away, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig under my feet. I wandered deeper and deeper, losing track of time and direction. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks wider and more gnarled. The underbrush thickened, grabbing at my clothes as I pushed through. And the sounds, they changed too. The cheerful chirping of birds gave way to something else. Something whispered. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I paused to listen, I could swear I heard words. Soft, indistinct, but definitely there. A chill ran down my spine, and for the first time, I felt truly afraid. I turned to go back, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all looked the same, looming over me, their branches reaching out like claws. Panic started to set in. I spun around, trying to find something, anything that looked familiar. That's when I saw her. She appeared so suddenly, I almost thought she was a part of the forest itself. A girl, about my age, standing between two ancient oaks. Her clothes were tattered and dirty, hanging off her thin frame. But it was her face that caught my attention. She had a scar, running from her left temple down to her chin. It was like looking in a mirror, but I didn't know why. "Are you lost?" Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but in the eerie silence of the forest, it rang out clear as a bell. I nodded, unable to find my voice. She smiled then, a small, sad thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Emily," she said, stepping closer. "I can help you get back." I should have been scared. A strange girl, appearing out of nowhere in the middle of the woods. But there was something about her that put me at ease. Maybe it was the scar, or the way she looked at me with understanding in her eyes. "Do your parents not buy you clothes?" The words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them. I immediately felt ashamed, but Emily just laughed. "These are all I have," she said, plucking at her threadbare shirt. "But it's okay. I don't need much out here." She held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. Her skin was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so in the summer heat. As we walked, Emily told me about the forest. She spoke of hidden clearings where fairies danced under the moonlight, of ancient trees that whispered secrets if you knew how to listen. Her words painted a picture of a magical, mysterious place, so different from the dark, forbidding woods I had wandered into. I found myself relaxing, drawn into her stories. We climbed over fallen logs, ducked under low-hanging branches, and splashed through a small stream. All the while, Emily kept talking, her voice a soothing counterpoint to the strange whispers I could still hear at the edge of my perception. "Why are you out here alone?" I finally asked as we paused to rest on a moss-covered rock. Emily's smile faltered for a moment. "I'm always here," she said softly. "This is my home." I wanted to ask more, but something in her expression stopped me. Instead, I told her about my life, about my distant parents, the loneliness at school, the feeling of not quite fitting in anywhere. "I understand," Emily said, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed too old for her young face. "It's hard to be alone." As we talked, I noticed the forest around us changing. The trees were thinning out, and I could see glimpses of the sky through the canopy. The whispers had faded, replaced by the more familiar sounds of birds and rustling leaves. "We're almost there," Emily said, pointing ahead. "Your house is just beyond those trees." Sure enough, as we pushed through a final cluster of bushes, I saw our old wooden house, standing silent in the fading afternoon light. I turned to thank Emily, but she was already backing away, melting into the shadows of the forest. "Will I see you again?" I called out, suddenly not wanting her to leave. She paused, half hidden behind a tree. "If you want to," she said. "I'm always here. But maybe don't tell your parents about me, okay? Adults, they don't always understand." Before I could respond, she was gone, leaving me standing at the edge of my yard, wondering if the whole thing had been a dream. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the creaking of the house and the distant sounds of the forest, I couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Who was she? Why was she living in the woods? And why did I feel such a strong connection to her? I wanted to tell my parents about her, to ask if they knew of any families living in the forest. But something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of Emily's warning, or maybe it was the knowledge that my parents would probably be too busy to listen anyway. The next day, and the day after that, I found myself drawn back to the woods. Each time, Emily would appear, as if by magic, to guide me through the trees. We played games, climbing trees and building little forts out of fallen branches. She taught me how to move silently through the underbrush, how to identify different plants and animal tracks. But there was always something off about our encounters. Sometimes, when I wasn't looking directly at her, Emily seemed to shimmer, like a mirage in the desert heat. And there were moments when her laughter echoed strangely, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I began to notice other things too. The whispers I had heard on that first day grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I would see shadows moving in ways that shadows shouldn't. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. As the summer wore on, I spent more and more time in the forest with Emily. My parents, caught up in their own lives, barely seemed to notice my absences. At school, the other kids started to give me even wider berth, whispering about the weird kid who talks to trees. But I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had a real friend. Someone who understood me, who didn't think I was strange or boring. With Emily, I could be myself. One day, as we sat by the stream where we often played, Emily turned to me with a serious expression. "Do you trust me?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I nodded without hesitation. "Of course." "Then I want to show you something," she said, standing up. "But you have to promise to keep it a secret. No matter what." Intrigued and a little nervous, I agreed. Emily took my hand and led me deeper into the forest than we had ever gone before. The trees here were ancient, their trunks wider than cars, their branches forming a canopy so thick that little light penetrated to the forest floor. The whispers grew louder as we walked, and more than once I thought I saw faces peering at us from behind the trees. But Emily kept moving forward, her grip on my hand tight and reassuring. Finally, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood a tree unlike any I had ever seen. Its trunk was twisted and gnarled, forming shapes that looked almost like faces frozen in expressions of agony or ecstasy. Its branches reached out in all directions, some touching the ground, others stretching up towards the small patch of sky visible above. "This is the heart of the forest," Emily said, her voice hushed with reverence. "It's been here since the beginning of time." As I stared at the tree, I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was as if the whispers I had been hearing all summer were emanating from this single point, calling out to me in a language I couldn't quite understand. Emily stepped forward and placed her hand on the trunk of the tree. To my amazement, the bark seemed to ripple under her touch, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a thrown stone. "The forest is alive," Emily said, turning back to me. "It sees everything, knows everything. And it's chosen you." I wanted to ask what she meant, but my voice seemed to have deserted me. The whispers had grown to a crescendo, filling my head with a cacophony of indecipherable sounds. Emily held out her hand to me. "Join us," she said, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Become part of the forest. You'll never be alone again." For a moment, I was tempted. The promise of never feeling lonely, of being part of something greater than myself, was almost overwhelming. I took a step forward, my hand reaching out towards Emily's. But then, cutting through the whispers, I heard another sound. A voice, calling my name. It was distant, but familiar. My mother's voice. The spell broke. I stumbled backward, suddenly terrified. The clearing seemed to darken, the faces in the tree trunk twisting into grotesque expressions. I have to go, I stammered, turning and running blindly into the woods. Behind me, I heard Emily call out, her voice a mixture of anger and sorrow. But I didn't stop. I ran and ran, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to trip me. Somehow, I found my way back to the edge of the forest. As I burst out of the trees, I saw my mother standing in our backyard, a look of concern on her face. "Where have you been?" she asked as I stumbled towards her. I've been calling for you for hours." I couldn't answer. I just threw myself into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Over her shoulder, I could see the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw Emily standing at the tree line, her eyes filled with sadness and something else, hunger. But then I blinked, and she was gone. That night, as I lay in bed, my mother's worried gaze still fresh in my mind, I made a decision. No matter how lonely I felt, no matter how tempting the forest's whispers might be, I wouldn't go back. The price was too high. As I drifted off to sleep, I could have sworn I heard Emily's voice on the wind, calling my name. But I pulled the covers over my head and tried to forget the strange, magical, terrifying summer that had almost changed everything. As summer faded into autumn, a change came over our small town. It was subtle at first, like a shift in the wind, but soon it became impossible to ignore. The once friendly faces of our neighbors began to twist with suspicion, their eyes following me as I walked down the street. Whispers trailed in my wake, hushed conversations that died as soon as I came within earshot. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a leftover paranoia from my strange experiences in the forest. But the evidence was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. It started with Mrs. Johnson's chickens. One morning, she woke to find her entire coop empty, not a feather left behind. The police came, but they found no signs of forced entry, no tracks leading away from the coop. It was as if the chickens had simply vanished into thin air. Then came Mr. Peterson's prized tomato plants. They had been the talk of the town, their vines heavy with plump, red fruit. But overnight, every single plant withered and died, their leaves turned black as if touched by an early frost. The thing was, it was still warm out, nowhere near cold enough for frost. These incidents might have been dismissed as unfortunate accidents or the work of particularly clever animals. But they were just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more inexplicable events plagued our town. Cattle went missing from locked barns. Gardens that had been thriving suddenly became barren wastelands. And always, there were the whispers. I couldn't help but feel that somehow, I was connected to all of this. The way people looked at me, their gazes a mixture of fear and accusation, made me think they felt the same way. But why? What had I done? The answer, of course, was Emily. Even though I had sworn to stay away from the forest after that terrifying night at the heart tree, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of a ragged figure standing at the edge of the woods. But when I turned to look, there was never anyone there. My parents, usually so absorbed in their own lives, began to take notice of the change in me. Mom started asking questions about where I'd been spending my time, her voice laced with concern and something else, fear. Dad, in his gruff way, suggested I spend more time with normal kids my age instead of moping around the house. Their sudden interest in my life should have been comforting. Instead, it felt suffocating. I found myself longing for the freedom of the forest, for Emily's understanding presence. But then I'd remember the hunger in her eyes that last night, the way the whispers had nearly overwhelmed me, and I'd push those feelings away. School became a special kind of torture. The other kids, who had mostly ignored me before, now went out of their way to avoid me. I'd enter a classroom and conversations would abruptly cease, replaced by meaningful looks and poorly concealed pointing. More than once, I opened my locker to find it stuffed with leaves and twigs, a crude reminder of my weirdness. The worst part was, I couldn't even defend myself. How could I explain that I hadn't done anything wrong, that the strange events in town had nothing to do with me? I couldn't tell them about Emily, about the living forest. They'd think I was crazy. Sometimes, I wondered if I was. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, my sleep became plagued by vivid, terrifying dreams. I'd find myself back in the forest, running through endless trees as whispers chased me. Sometimes, I'd come face to face with Emily, but her features would be twisted, inhuman. She'd reach for me with branch-like fingers, her mouth opening impossibly wide as she called my name. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the echo of those whispers still ringing in my ears. More than once, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the corner of my room, watching me. But it would always vanish as soon as I turned on the light. The lack of sleep began to take its toll. I became jumpy, irritable. My grades, never great to begin with, started to plummet. I'd find myself zoning out in class, staring out the window at the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. More than once, a teacher had to call my name several times to get my attention, their voices tinged with a mixture of annoyance and unease. One particularly bad day, after I'd fallen asleep in class and woken up screaming from a nightmare, the principal called my parents in for a meeting. I sat outside his office, listening to the muffled voices inside. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. Concern, frustration, and underlying it all, fear. When my parents emerged, Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, and Dad's jaw was set in a hard line. The drive home was silent, thick with unspoken tensions. As soon as we got home, Mom sat me down at the kitchen table. Her voice was gentle, but I could hear the strain beneath it as she asked me if everything was okay, if there was anything I wanted to talk about. I wanted to tell her everything. About Emily, about the forest, about the whispers that seemed to follow me everywhere now. But the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? So I just shook my head, mumbled something about being tired, and retreated to my room. That night, as I lay in bed trying to fight off sleep and the nightmares it would bring, I heard a tapping at my window. At first, I thought it was just a branch blown by the wind. But it was too rhythmic, too insistent. With a growing sense of dread, I turned to look. There, framed in the moonlight, was Emily's face. She looked exactly as she had that first day in the forest, her clothes tattered, her hair wild. But her eyes were different. They glowed with an eerie, greenish light, and there was something desperate in them. I wanted to scream, to call for my parents, but I found myself frozen in place. Emily's lips moved, and though the window was closed, I could hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing right next to me. "Why'd you stop coming?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I thought we were friends. I showed you all the cool stuff in the forest, and then you just left me." I shook my head, trying to deny her words, but no sound came out. Emily's expression darkened. "You can't just ignore us," she said, her eyes narrowing. "The forest picked you. It's gonna keep trying to get you back." With that, she vanished, leaving me staring at my own terrified reflection in the glass. I spent the rest of the night huddled under my blankets, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The next morning, I found a small sapling growing in a crack in the sidewalk in front of our house. It hadn't been there the day before, I was sure of it. As I stared at it, a chill ran down my spine. It was the same type of tree as the one at the heart of the forest. I knew then that Emily had been right. I couldn't escape. The forest was coming for me, whether I wanted it to or not. The incidents in town continued to escalate. People reported seeing strange lights in the woods at night. There were whispers of eerie music carried on the wind, of shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. And always, I felt eyes on me. Accusing eyes, fearful eyes. The eyes of the townspeople who were sure, somehow, that I was at the center of it all. And maybe I was. Maybe everything that was happening was because I had dared to befriend Emily, to step into a world I didn't understand. I found myself withdrawing more and more. I stopped going to school, claiming illness. I rarely left my room, spending my days staring out the window at the forest that seemed to creep closer with each passing day. My parents argued in hushed voices, their words a mixture of concern and frustration. I heard phrases like professional help and sending him away, but I couldn't bring myself to care. All I could think about was Emily, and the choice she had offered me that night at the heart tree. Join the forest, become part of something greater than myself. Never be alone again. It had terrified me then, but now it was starting to sound tempting. One night, as the full moon hung low and heavy in the sky, I made my decision. I couldn't live like this anymore, caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. I had to choose. I slipped out of the house while my parents slept, their soft snores a counterpoint to the whispers that seemed to fill the air. The night was cool, a light mist clinging to the ground as I made my way towards the forest. As I reached the tree line, I hesitated. This was my last chance to turn back, to try to return to a normal life. But then I heard Emily's voice, carried on the wind. "Come on," she called softly. "We've been waiting for you." Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the shadows of the trees. The forest seemed to come alive around me, branches reaching out to brush against my skin, leaves rustling in a non-existent breeze. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of them. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the depths of the forest. But eventually, I found myself in a familiar clearing. The heart tree stood before me, its twisted trunk seeming to pulse with an inner light. And there, standing at its base, was Emily. She smiled as I approached, a mix of relief and excitement on her face. "You came back," she said, sounding relieved. "I knew you would. Want to see something really cool?" As our fingers touched, I felt a surge of something. Power, maybe, or knowledge. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and suddenly, I could understand them. They were welcoming me home. I looked at Emily, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw her for what she truly was. Not a lonely girl living in the woods, but a spirit of the forest itself. And now, I was becoming like her. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the canopy, I felt myself changing. My skin took on a greenish hue, my hair becoming like leaves. I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I was home. I was where I belonged. In the years that followed, our town would become known for its mysterious disappearances. Children would dare each other to venture into the woods, only to run home crying about the strange girl and boy they saw dancing among the trees. Parents would warn their kids to stay away from the forest, spinning tales of the spirits that lived there. But for me, it was simply life. Emily and I became the guardians of the forest, protecting it from those who would do it harm. And if sometimes we lured a lonely soul into our realm, well, that was just the way of things. After all, the forest is always hungry for new stories, new lives to add to its ancient tapestry. And who are we to deny it? Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest memories. As the years passed, the events of that strange summer began to feel more like a half-remembered dream than reality. I threw myself into my studies, partly out of a genuine desire to succeed, but mostly as a way to keep my mind occupied. The less I thought about the past, the easier it was to pretend it had never happened. High school came and went in a blur of textbooks and awkward social interactions. Our small town, with its limited population of kids my age, didn't offer much in the way of friendship opportunities. I was always the quiet one, the loner who spent lunch breaks in the library or wandering the school grounds alone. At the time, I told myself it was by choice, that I preferred solitude. But deep down, I knew the truth. I simply didn't know how to connect with others. When it came time to choose a college, I opted for a university in the city, as far from the woods and small-town life as I could get. The day I left for college felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. Here was my chance to start over, to be someone new. The city was a shock to my system after years in our small town. The constant noise, the crowds, the sheer energy of the place was overwhelming at first. But I soon grew to love it. Here, I was just another face in the crowd. No one looked at me with suspicion or whispered behind my back. I could be whoever I wanted to be. It was during my first semester that I met Olivia. We were paired up for a project in our introduction to psychology class. At first, I was terrified. Group projects had always been a source of anxiety for me, a reminder of my inability to connect with peers. But Olivia was different. She was bright, funny, and had a way of putting people at ease. When she suggested we meet up at a local coffee shop to work on our project, I found myself agreeing before I could overthink it. That first meeting was awkward, at least on my part. I fumbled with my words, spilled coffee on my notes, and was sure I was making a complete fool of myself. But Olivia just laughed it off, her smile warm and genuine. "You know," she said as we were packing up to leave, "we should hang out sometime. Not for the project, I mean. Just as friends." I must have looked shocked because she quickly added, "Unless you don't want to, of course. No pressure." "No, I'd like that," I heard myself say. And to my surprise, I meant it. Over the next few weeks, Olivia and I started spending more time together. We'd grab coffee between classes, study together in the library, or just hang out in her dorm room watching bad reality TV shows. It was nice. More than nice, really. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had a real friend. One night, as we were walking back from a late-night study session, Olivia turned to me with a curious expression. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded, a bit wary. "How come you never talk about your friends from back home? I mean, I've told you all about my high school buddies, but you never mention anyone." I felt my stomach drop. This was the moment I'd been dreading, the question I'd hoped would never come up. For a moment, I considered lying, making up stories about friends who didn't exist. But looking at Olivia's open, honest face, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't really have any, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Friends, I mean. Back home." Olivia was quiet for a moment, and I braced myself for the pity or awkward silence I was sure would follow. But instead, she just bumped her shoulder against mine gently. "Well, you've got one now," she said simply. I felt a lump form in my throat, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of her words. In that moment, I wanted to tell her everything, about the loneliness, about Emily, about the strange events in the forest. But I held back. Some things were better left in the past. As the years went by, I found myself settling into a life I never thought I'd have. I made more friends, joined clubs, even went on a few dates. I chose to major in psychology, fascinated by the workings of the human mind. Perhaps, subconsciously, I was still trying to understand my own experiences, to find some explanation for what had happened. But I never spoke about Emily or the forest. Those memories, once so vivid, were carefully packed away in the furthest corners of my mind. On the rare occasions when thoughts of that summer surfaced, I pushed them down, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and unease. It was easier to pretend it had never happened, to chalk it up to an overactive childhood imagination. Sometimes, late at night when the city finally quieted down, I would find myself thinking about the girl I used to be. The lonely child who was so desperate for a friend that she conjured one up from the depths of the forest. I felt a strange mix of pity and affection for that girl, but also a deep sense of relief that I had moved past that phase of my life. As I approached graduation, I found myself at a crossroads. I had been offered a position in a prestigious graduate program, with the potential to eventually become a child psychologist. It was a clear path forward, a chance at a stable, respectable career. But there was a part of me that hesitated, wondering if I was making the right choice. The night before I had to give my answer, I had a dream. I was back in the forest, standing before the heart tree. For a moment, I thought I saw Emily's face reflected in its gnarled bark. But when I looked closer, it was my own younger self staring back at me. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. But as I lay there in the pre-dawn darkness, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The dream wasn't a callback to the past, but a reminder of how far I'd come. That morning, I called the graduate program and accepted their offer. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of excitement for the future ahead. The forest and Emily were part of my past, a chapter in my life that had shaped me but no longer defined me. I had grown, made real connections, and found my place in the world. And that, I realized, was the greatest magic of all. It's funny how the past can come back to haunt you when you least expect it. I had spent years building a life for myself, carefully constructing walls to keep the memories of that summer at bay. But as I sat across from my latest patient, a young girl with wide, frightened eyes, those walls began to crumble. She spoke of whispers in the woods, of a friend no one else could see. Her words sent a chill down my spine, awakening something I had long tried to forget. That night, for the first time in years, I dreamed of Emily. The nightmares came in fragments, disjointed scenes that left me gasping for air. I saw flashes of the forest, heard the rustling of leaves and the faint echo of laughter. And always, at the edge of my vision, a figure just out of reach. I tried to rationalize it, to apply my years of psychological training to my own experiences. But how do you explain away the inexplicable? How do you reconcile the impossible with what you know to be true? As the weeks passed, the dreams intensified. I found myself losing focus during sessions, my mind wandering to half-remembered moments from my childhood. More than once, I caught myself staring out the window of my office, searching the cityscape for a glimpse of trees. It was during one of these moments of distraction that I received the call. My mother's voice, tight with worry, informing me of my father's accident. I felt a sense of dread wash over me as she asked me to come home. Home. The word itself seemed to carry a weight I wasn't prepared for. The drive back to my hometown was surreal. As the urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills and dense forest, I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the impending reunion with my injured father. When I finally saw the welcome sign for our little town, I had to pull over, overcome by a wave of emotions I couldn't quite name. The town looked much the same as it had when I left, yet somehow smaller, more confined. As I drove down the main street, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Faces peered out from behind curtains, eyes following my car as it passed. I told myself it was just small-town curiosity, but a part of me wondered if they remembered. If they knew. My childhood home stood at the edge of town, a silent sentinel against the encroaching forest. As I stepped out of the car, the wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell so familiar it made my heart ache. For a moment, I thought I heard a whisper on the breeze, a soft voice calling my name. But when I turned to look, there was only the rustling of leaves. Inside, the house was a time capsule of memories. Photos on the walls tracked my growth from a smiling child to an awkward teenager, the progression a stark reminder of the years I'd spent trying to forget. My mother greeted me with a tight hug, her eyes red-rimmed from worry and lack of sleep. As she updated me on my father's condition, I found my gaze drawn to the window, to the line of trees that marked the border of our property. Was it my imagination, or did the shadows seem to move, reaching out towards the house like grasping fingers? That night, as I lay in my old bed, the sounds of the forest seemed to press in around me. The creaking of the house, once a comforting lullaby, now felt ominous. In the darkness, shapes seemed to form and reform, and more than once I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with dreams. I was back in the forest, running through endless trees as whispers chased me. Ahead, I saw a clearing, and in its center stood Emily. But as I approached, her features began to shift and change, becoming something other, something not quite human. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The room was filled with the gray light of dawn, and for a moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where or when I was. As I sat up, trying to shake off the lingering tendrils of the dream, my eyes fell on something that made my blood run cold. There, on the windowsill, sat a single pine cone. It hadn't been there when I went to sleep, I was sure of it. As I stared at it, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Emily, holding out a similar pine cone, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light as she whispered, "A gift from the forest." With shaking hands, I reached for the pine cone. As my fingers touched its rough surface, I felt a jolt, like static electricity but stronger. And in that moment, I knew. The past wasn't done with me. Emily wasn't done with me. Whatever had happened that summer, whatever I had tried so hard to forget, it was calling me back. And this time, I didn't think I could ignore it. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits and hushed conversations. My father's condition was stable but serious, and the weight of worry hung heavy over our household. Yet even as I went through the motions of being a supportive son, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I found myself drawn to the woods at the edge of our property. During the day, I would stand at the tree line, peering into the shadows between the trunks, searching for, what? A glimpse of a tattered dress. A flash of familiar eyes. At night, I would lie awake, listening to the whispers of the wind through the leaves, trying to discern words in the rustling. It was during one of these late-night vigils that I heard it, a soft, melodic humming coming from the forest. The tune was hauntingly familiar, a lullaby that Emily used to sing. Before I could think better of it, I was out of bed and heading for the door. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped outside. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. As I approached the forest's edge, the humming grew louder, more insistent. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the rough bark of a pine tree. This was madness, surely. I was a grown man, a psychologist. I knew better than to chase ghosts in the woods. And yet, I took a step forward, then another. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out to brush against my face and arms. The humming was all around me now, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, I found myself in a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, creating patterns on the forest floor. And there, in the center of the clearing, stood a figure. For a moment, my heart leapt, Emily? But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it was just an oddly shaped tree stump. Disappointment and relief warred within me as I approached the stump. As I got closer, I noticed something strange about its surface. There were markings carved into the wood, crude symbols that seemed vaguely familiar. I reached out to trace them with my fingers, and as I did, a flood of memories washed over me. I remembered the day I first met Emily, her tattered dress and wild hair. I remembered the games we played, the secrets she shared about the forest. And I remembered the night at the heart tree, the choice she had offered me. The choice I had run from. As the memories came, so did the questions. Had Emily been real? Or had she been a product of my lonely, imaginative mind? And if she had been real, what had happened to her? I don't know how long I stood there, lost in thought. But eventually, I became aware of a change in the air. The forest had gone silent. No wind in the leaves, no creak of branches. Even the ever-present whispers had ceased. The silence was oppressive, expectant. And then I heard it. A twig snapping behind me. I whirled around, my heart in my throat. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. For a moment, I thought it was Emily, but as I blinked, the image seemed to shift and change. Was it a young girl, or an old woman? A trick of the light, or something more? Before I could make sense of what I was seeing, the figure retreated into the shadows. I called out, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the quiet forest. But there was no response. I made my way back home in a daze, my mind reeling. As I crawled back into bed, the first light of dawn was starting to creep over the horizon. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. There were too many questions, too many unresolved mysteries. I spent the next few days in a state of heightened awareness. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every whisper of wind a hidden message. I began to research the history of our town, spending hours in the local library poring over old newspapers and town records. What I found both fascinated and terrified me. There had been other incidents over the years, other children who had spoken of friends in the forest, other disappearances that had never been fully explained. And always, always, the woods loomed large in these stories. As I dug deeper, I came across a photograph that made my blood run cold. It was from a newspaper article dated nearly 50 years before I was born, reporting on the disappearance of a young girl. The girl in the photo could have been Emily's twin. The same wild hair, the same haunting eyes. The same scar running down her cheek. The article didn't name the girl, but it mentioned that she had last been seen near the woods, talking to someone that no one else could see. The search had been called off after a week, the girl presumed dead. But there had never been a body found. I sat back, my mind whirling. Could it be possible? Could Emily have been real? Not just a figment of my imagination, but something more? Something older, more mysterious? As I pondered these questions, I became aware of a presence behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see Emily standing there. Instead, I found myself face to face with the librarian, an elderly woman who had known me since I was a child. She looked at the article I had been reading, then back at me. Her eyes were sad, knowing. "You've remembered, haven't you?" she said softly. "About the forest. About her." I nodded, unable to speak. The librarian sighed, settling into the chair next to me. "There are things in this world," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that we can't explain. Things that live in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. The forest, it's one of those things." She told me then of the legends that had been passed down through generations in our town. Of the forest that was more than just trees and earth. Of the spirits that dwelled within it, sometimes benevolent, sometimes not. And of the children who had been drawn to its mysteries over the years. As she spoke, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a world I had always known existed but had never fully seen. A world where Emily could be both real and not real, both a lonely girl and something far more ancient. When I left the library that day, the world seemed different. The trees at the edge of town no longer looked like simple plants, but sentinels guarding ancient secrets. The whispers in the wind carried weight, meaning. I knew then that I couldn't leave, not yet. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. Whatever had happened that summer all those years ago, whatever Emily had been or still was, I needed to understand it. As I walked home, the sun setting behind the trees, I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. The rational part of my mind, the part that had been trained in psychology and science, rebelled against what I was considering. But another part, a deeper, more instinctual part, recognized the truth of what the librarian had said. There are things in this world we can't explain. And sometimes, the only way to find peace is to face them head-on. That night, as I stood at my bedroom window looking out at the forest, I made a decision. I would go back into the woods. I would find the heart tree. And this time, I would face whatever waited for me there. As if in response to my thoughts, I saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing there, watching me. And then it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Whatever happened next, I knew my life would never be the same. The forest was calling, and this time, I would answer. The morning after my nocturnal adventure in the woods, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The mysteries of my childhood, long buried under layers of denial and rationalization, demanded answers. and I was determined to find them. I started my investigation where any good researcher would, the local library. The elderly librarian who had spoken to me before seemed unsurprised by my return. She led me to a section of old newspapers and town records, her gnarled fingers pointing out articles and documents that might be of interest. As I pored over the yellowed pages, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades, there were reports of strange occurrences in the town. Children speaking of invisible friends, unexplained disappearances, whispers of something ancient and otherworldly in the woods. But always, these stories were dismissed, rationalized away, or simply forgotten. One article in particular caught my eye. Dated just a few months before my birth, it detailed a tragic accident involving a young girl. She had fallen from a treehouse, sustaining severe injuries including a distinctive scar on her face. The description of the scar sent a chill down my spine. It was identical to the one I had always associated with Emily. With shaking hands, I read on. The girl had survived but suffered traumatic brain injury, resulting in severe memory loss and personality changes. Her name wasn't mentioned, but the article noted that her family had moved away shortly after the incident, unable to cope with the tragedy and the whispers that followed. Could it be? Had Emily been real after all? Not a ghost or a forest spirit, but a traumatized child whose story had somehow become entangled with my own? I left the library with more questions than answers, my mind reeling. As I walked home, lost in thought, I nearly collided with an old man shuffling down the sidewalk. I apologized, but as I moved to step around him, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You're the one," he wheezed, his rheumy eyes fixed on my face. "The one who used to play in the woods with her." I froze, unable to speak. The old man's grip tightened. "Listen to me, boy," he said, his voice urgent. "The woods have secrets. Dark secrets. Your friend, she wasn't what you thought. None of it was." Before I could respond, he released my arm and shuffled away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding. His words echoed in my mind, adding yet another layer to the mystery I was trying to unravel. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing before the mirror in my childhood bedroom. I stared at my reflection, searching for, what? Some sign of the boy I had been? Some hint of the truth I was seeking? And then I saw it. Just below my hairline, usually hidden by my hair, was a thin, faded scar. A scar I had no memory of receiving. With trembling fingers, I traced its length, and suddenly, like a dam breaking, the memories came flooding back. I remembered the treehouse, the fall, the searing pain and the darkness that followed. And I remembered the long months of recovery, filled with confusion and fear. The way people looked at me differently, spoke about me in hushed tones when they thought I couldn't hear. But most of all, I remembered Emily. Not as a mysterious figure in the woods, but as a creation of my injured, traumatized mind. A friend when I needed one most, a way to cope with the loneliness and fear that consumed me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I sank to the floor, my back against the cool wall, as the truth of my past washed over me. The woods, the whispers, the heart tree, all of it had been an elaborate fantasy, a story I had told myself to make sense of a world that had suddenly become frightening and unpredictable. As the first light of dawn began to creep through my window, I made a decision. It was time to face the woods one last time, not as a seeker of supernatural mysteries, but as a man confronting the ghosts of his past. The forest looked different in the harsh light of day. The trees that had seemed so menacing in the dark now stood silent and indifferent. I made my way to the clearing where I had always imagined the heart tree to be. But there was no twisted, ancient oak waiting for me. Just a small, unremarkable sapling, probably not more than a few years old. I sat down beside it, feeling the damp earth beneath me, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to truly remember. Not the fantastical version of events I had constructed, but the real, painful truth. The loneliness after the accident. The way other children had shied away from the boy with the scar and the strange, fragmented memories. The comfort I had found in my imaginary friend, the stories I had spun to make sense of my trauma. As I sat there, I felt a presence beside me. For a moment, my heart leapt, thinking it might be Emily. But when I turned, I saw my mother standing there, concern etched on her face. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly, sitting down beside me. "You always used to come to this spot when you were upset." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the years of worry and love written in the lines around her eyes. "Mom," I said, my voice cracking. "I remember. About the accident. About everything." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "We wanted to tell you so many times. But the doctor said it was better to let you remember on your own. And then, as the years passed, it seemed kinder to let you keep your version of events." We sat there in silence for a long time, the gentle rustling of leaves the only sound. Finally, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind. Was there ever a real Emily? My mother sighed. "There was a girl, yes. She lived next door to us for a short time after your accident. I think you might have merged her in your mind with the friend you had created. She moved away before you fully recovered." As we talked, piecing together the fragments of my past, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The mysteries that had haunted me for so long were not supernatural, but all too human. A child's way of coping with trauma, of making sense of a world that had suddenly become frightening and unpredictable. In the days that followed, I spent time with my parents, asking questions I had never dared to ask before. I learned about the months following my accident, about their fears and hopes as they watched their son retreat into a world of his own making. I also spoke with my father's doctors, gaining a new understanding of how trauma can affect the brain, how memories can be altered or suppressed. Everything I had experienced, everything I had believed about Emily and the forest, suddenly made sense in a new, if no less painful, way. As my time in my hometown drew to a close, I found myself once again standing at the edge of the woods. But this time, I felt no fear, no irresistible pull. The forest was just a forest, beautiful, mysterious in its own way, but ultimately just a part of the natural world. I thought about Emily, the friend I had created in my loneliness, the companion who had helped me through the darkest period of my life. In a way, I owed her a debt of gratitude. But it was time to let her go. "Goodbye, Emily," I whispered to the trees. "Thank you." As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw a young girl with wild hair and a scarred cheek, smiling at me from between the trees. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there but shadows and leaves. I smiled to myself, recognizing the moment for what it was: not a supernatural encounter, but a final farewell from a part of myself I no longer needed. As I walked back to my parents' house, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The mysteries of my childhood had been solved, the ghosts laid to rest. There would always be a part of me that remembered the magic of those woods, the comfort I had found in my imaginary friend. But I was no longer bound by those memories. I was ready to move forward, to face the real world with all its joys and sorrows, its mundane mysteries and everyday magic. And if sometimes, in quiet moments, I thought I heard a whisper on the wind or saw a flicker of movement in the shadows, well, perhaps there's room in this world for a little mystery after all.